The cottage. With a cheery smile, laden with joy and comfort, the man stands in front of a smouldering hot cup of coffee. Breathing in the smell of the sweet mountain air that was circulating through his cottage, mixed with that inescapable scent of dark roast, he sips lightly from the cup of steamed and bitter coffee bean juice. The cottage was filled with a thick layer of that wafting smell that we all knew and loved, and as he sat down in his leather-bound armchair, he was interrupted. He stood up swiftly, buttoning his maroon cardigan, and as he ran his fingers through his thick black hair that kept him warm during months like these, he looked out the window to see 2 feet of snow on the ground, and the man was genuinely surprised to see that there was really a man knocking at his door, and it wasn't some nasty little weasel or a squirrel. With little thought, the inhabitant of this small warm cottage in the middle of Maine's densely populated forest, densely populated by trees at least, lets the stranger onto his porch with welcoming arms. Upon entering the wooden abode, there were no words spoken. It was a moment of pure instinctual reaction. The absence of sound was apparent to the man who lived there, so he thought he might leave the room to begin cooking a meal and let the stranger settle in. Before he could leave the room, he noticed the man was clutching something that stuck to his hands with a layer of glue-like ice. He was holding a knife that was frozen into his hands. The cottage shook with a trembling force that almost knocked the stranger over. Thunderstorms are rare, but they happen sometimes here in Maine. You don't typically see the snow turn to thunder, but they do happen. Why the knife? The man finally says, breaking the wall of silence. The stranger immediately opens his hands, and with that, parts of skin rip away from the hundreds of tiny little metatarsal bones within one's hand. With absolutely no physical reaction to his hands being torn apart, due to most likely the hypothermia setting in, he drops the knife and begins to frantically apologize, as if he snapped out of some vivid imaginary dream that filled him with so much dread that he couldn't move. Maybe it wasn't the ice that was freezing him. The signals, they needed to be sent from the brain to his feet. They weren't getting there. The pathways, the neural networks in which they could synaptically be sent, they were frozen shut with a mixture of cold and, frankly, mainly terror. The stranger looks down at his hands and down at the knife on the ground with the pieces of his skin still stuck to it, and the man whose home he just waltzed into. Can you, after minutes of hypothermic rambling, the man approached the stranger with an embrace of a warm hug. In less than a second, the man, who so quickly came in incoherent and rambling and uncontrollably shaken, it all stopped. His body was finally returning to homeostasis. Yes, I can help you, the man in the cardigan said gently. Come with me, he offers with a warm smile. The man takes the chapped hand of the stranger, and it causes the blood to unfreeze and begin pouring out onto the hardwood mahogany flooring of this tiny little cottage. And within a few seconds, the stranger began feeling lightheaded, and seconds later, he fell into the arms of the man, passing out. That was the last thing he remembered. Whether he passed out from blood loss, hypothermia, or terror, that is unknown. But when the stranger came to, he was on a boat. He was warm. He had a bed under him, and the room in which he lied was stocked with a large portion of food. The rough estimate put him at a week's worth of rations at least, and if he really managed to, he could probably stretch it into 2. Confused and hungry, he stood up to grab a granola bar from the box of Quaker Oats to his left, but he falls to the ground, falling directly into the stack of food and items of canned goods that were most likely left to him by the man that found him, or the man that he found. The man that did find him was nowhere to be found. The room was tiny, and it was shaking a little bit, rocking back and forth. The stranger looked up at the ceiling of his ocean vessel, and He noticed a weird symbol painted in red, and it sort of resembled the Versace logo. Upon closer inspection, he realized that it was not indeed a Versace logo. It was a painting of Medusa's head, and the paint was still wet. A droplet of this paint smacked him in the face, and when he touched it lightly and sniffed, he realized it was blood. He then noticed that his hands had bandaged heavily, and they were no longer visible to him under what seemed like at least two packs of gauze. He thought that it was his blood that the Medusa head was painted of, and that thought perturbed him. He wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He scrambled around in that boat cabin for a long while, not realizing that he was in a boat cabin, until luck struck. He moved the backs of Captain Crunch, and behind it was a small hole. One that certainly couldn't fit a human, let alone a child, and at most a mouse on its 10th day without food could fit through that hole. He laughed to himself. He realized that his hands were immobilized and that he couldn't even begin to try to break out of that hole without some sort of tool. So instead, he put up his size 12 hiking boots up to the wall, above the hole, and started kicking as hard as he could. After dozens and dozens and dozens of powerful kicks, the most power he could put into him, the wall finally gave but an inch. Barely moved. His actions were causing more and more boxes to fall and clutter and randomly stack, and he gave up, winded, sweating. It was surprisingly warm in that boat. He contemplated giving up. He turned his back and he looked up. He turned to his back and he looked up. An idea struck him at that moment. The ceiling, with the bloody Medusa head staring into his soul. The eyes so detailed, they looked real. It wasn't made of the same material that the rest of the boat cabin was. There were no doors, no portholes, not even a window. And the stranger realized that the ceiling was actually a thin layer of paper. And that paper was tightly covering the top of this boat with a very light punch. His padded glove-like hand pressed straight through. Shocked, he gets a streak of unrivaled excitement, and he stands straight up, crushing tins of boxes of food. This was indeed a mistake. The man watched from his cottage, the small pond just outside his cottage window, trembling under the frantic shaking of a small canoe. And he smiled. He took a sip of his coffee,